Hello, political science students. This is Mr. Stark. Um, I miss all of you. It really breaks my heart that I can't be there in person to teach you guys the rest of your time as seniors. I miss our conversations. I miss our laughs. I miss the really profound points and ideas that you guys share. Um, so I just want to make it clear that you are definitely missed and. Yeah, I don't know what to say from there, but I hope to be able to see you all at some point before we all go our separate ways. Uh, but we have one more chapter to do, and that is chapter 12 on political violence. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, when political violence comes to mind, uh, different people have different ideas that come into their head. Some people think of 9/11, which is a good example of political violence. Some people think of, people fighting over politics, sometimes physically, such as this famous instance among two members in Congress literally fighting over slavery. One was almost killed, beaten to death about it. Others might be political riots. I believe this one was taken as a part of the Egyptian revolution that we saw from the documentary The Square. The actual definition of political violence is simply the use of physical violence or the threat of physical violence to achieve political goals. So it doesn't necessarily have to be actual physical violence, it can be the threat of physical violence as well. Examples, terrorism, prime example, political revolutions, um, rioting, ethnic cleansing and genocide. We just got done talking a little bit about Rwanda. So the first type we're going to look at is what's known as state violence against individuals or groups. So this is basically the government, the official federal government or another level of government committing violence against individuals or groups. And there's many reasons why this might occur. Some can be legitimized by law, some under no circumstances can be legitimized. Most state violence at least comes under the veneer or auspice of order maintenance. So they're trying to maintain order. Remember that first goal of every state is security. And if you can't keep internal security or order in your country, you really don't have a country. So states are willing to use violence to maintain that first goal. Usually, citizens support order maintenance, a certain level of violence to maintain order. Now, I think most citizens would say it shouldn't be the first step that's taken to maintain order. There's obviously, well, when I was a policeman, we had what's called a force pyramid or a force triangle, where you start at the lowest level of force, such as simply officer presence, which was a majority of the circumstances, the bottom level of the triangle. Then you had verbal commands. Then you had soft tissue contact, which is like putting your hands on someone, guiding them, or even putting handcuffs on them or putting them into certain control holds. Then you had hard tissue contact, which would be things like using your baton, and then you had non-lethal force, which would be things like your taser or pepper spray. And then you had lethal force, which forms the very tip of the pyramid, which is only used in the most extreme circumstances. Same thing with countries, hopefully. Now, with that being said, order maintenance can also be an excuse to resort to violence for very minor infractions. So we all know examples of countries where violence is used by the police, the military, for simply gathering in a park because they see it as a threat to their regime. That obviously is not really legitimate, but they're using the order maintenance rationale to do that. When left unchecked, states' legitimate use of violence can be turned against political opponents. We see that in Russia. As I told you before, Putin doesn't have to cheat, but he does. He has his police, his intelligence officials go after political opponents, physically assault them. They uses intimidation tactics, uses frivolous charges against them. That is what unchecked use of force can lead to. This is Hosni Mubarak, the former dictator of Egypt, who you just learned about when we watched The Square. We all know about Fidel Castro, who came in under the promise of social equality, but then became as bad a tyrant as Batista, the Western-backed dictator who he supplanted. And of course, there's Putin, as I just talked about. No need to explain that. This is a map that shows you between the years of 2010 and 2014 the areas of the country that saw the most internal political violence. So the government using violence against their own people. Interestingly enough, you see Russia as having the highest, or one of the highest. And then you have Iran, obviously, as one as well. This little teardrop by India is Sri Lanka, another very volatile country. So yeah, Turkey being one as well. China, no surprises there. Mexico having a reasonable level, and some other South American countries as well. This is called the terrorism and political violence map. We'll get to terrorism probably in a future lecture, but this shows you some areas of the world that are political violence hotspots. Of course, continent of Africa is on fire, as you can see there. We talked about the legacy of colonialism and what that's done to the people, to the governments, to so many things there. So what does the state or the countries use for order maintenance? Security forces. This can be anything from police to military. It can be paramilitary, which are like unofficial groups in areas in Central America where street gangs like MS-13 and others, MS-18 and other street gangs basically have almost unchecked power. They control entire sections of cities. They control prisons. They basically have, the black market is out in the open. The government does not have the money, the resources, or the courage to stand up to them. You have a lot of paramilitary groups of, better word for it would be vigilantes or militias that go around hunting down MS-13 members and shooting them on the spot if they identify them through word of mouth or gang tattoos or whatever. Those would be unofficial security forces. The penal system is another way in which they use violence, such as judges or magistrates, which is in some countries they have judges versus magistrates. Judges would have a little more power at the federal level than magistrates at the state or local level, but in the hands or in the pocket of the president or the dictator can also exercise political violence, such as prisons, jails, prison camps. Those are all tools as well. And the cost of state-sanctioned violence, enormous. In the 20th century, 300 million people were killed by government violence and war. Tragedy. Terrible. 86% of that, excess of 250 million of those people, was the government killing its own citizens. Now, if you click on this hyperlink, you'll go to a video talking about some of the worst offenders. I think the 10 worst offenders of the dictators who killed their own people. You'll see a lot of well-known people: Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, lots of others as well. Here's some of the right there. Mao Zedong, through famine, through his political forces, through numerous hands that he, numerous tools that he had his hands on, over 76 million of his own people were killed. Stalin was 42.6, Hitler 20.9, King Leopold of Belgium colonized the Congo, excess of 10 million people. It was the Belgian colonists that started the practice of punishing slaves or punishing the indigenous population by severing arms or legs to either prevent them from escaping, prevent them from fighting, or just basically warn everyone else this is what happens when you try to go against us. That practice is still in effect today. The next type of political violence we have is individual versus individual, so one-on-one. Most individual violence is not politically motivated. So it's a well-known axiom in police forces that murder, the unlawful homicide, it's not a complex thing. I mean, people love watching detective shows, Criminal Minds, all these others where murder is this twisted plot. It just takes an hour to explain. Most murder is fairly easy to solve. It's people who the victim knew. They leave easy signs. Even people who try to get away with it, it's very hard. So most individual versus individual violence or killing is, in the criminal system, it's not political. But some examples of individual political violence could be a political assassination. I'm sure you're probably thinking of JFK, President Lincoln, McKinley, U.S. presidents, and foreign leaders abroad face this risk. Political enmity. So when political rivals becomes deadly, such as the Aaron Burr versus Alexander Hamilton, the duel, which ended with the death of Alexander Hamilton. Violence against someone for their political affiliation or voting record. It is an unfortunate effect of our polarized political culture that no longer are people just exchanging words with people they disagree with. It's becoming more and more violent. We would talk more about the role of identity politics in that, but unfortunately, we can't get into that over lecture on the computer. This is the famous painting of Aaron Burr shooting Alexander Hamilton. Just really quick, the very actual duels where one person was killed, they both were trying to kill each other, was actually pretty rare. Most duels with pistols ended with they went back to back, marched 20, 15, or 20 paces away. Anything more than that, and the guns were grossly inaccurate, which they still were. They point their pistols up in the air and they fire them. That was the duel. Their animosity was done. Legend has it, Hamilton followed that suit. He turned around, fired his pistol in the air. Aaron Burr waited for him to do that, leveled his pistol nice and coolly at Alexander Hamilton, and shot and killed him. And that ends this first lecture for Chapter 12. So go ahead and answer the challenge questions 1 and 2 on the Google form and submit them. Again, I miss you all. I thoroughly enjoyed having you seniors. Honestly, it was one of the bright parts of my semester was being able to start off my B days with seniors that I already knew, that I already had a relationship with, and that I knew would make teaching enjoyable, which you all did. So I miss you, and I look forward to again seeing and talking with you all again. So until then, Mr. Stark out. Hello, political science students. This is Mr. Stark. Today we are going to cover just one topic for our short lecture, and that is terrorism, which falls under the category of group versus individual political violence. So first, there are over 1,000 different definitions for terrorism out there. The one we are going to go with is politically motivated violence against non-combatants. So breaking it down a little bit, politically motivated, that includes things like religious ideology, revolutionary ideology, things like that. So that kind of falls underneath politically for the sake of semantics. And then non-combatants, those are civilians. Those include basically those who aren't soldiers or police or people who are trained to defend themselves against violent attacks. Just random date, in 2013, 93 countries had terrorist attacks. Over 9,700 attacks 17,000 deaths, and 32,500 injuries. If you do the math, at one of your discussion questions about this, we'll have this stat, but you have about a 1 in, I think it's 20 million chance of being involved in a terrorist incident, give or take a few percent there. Over half of the fatalities were in just 3 countries, and I think you'll see that those are probably still pretty consistent even today, those being Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Those 3 countries had over half of the fatalities. This map shows you the impact of terrorism, the countries in which they've had the highest economic, human life being taken, things like that. As you can see, Nigeria is this little country, or a somewhat large country in Africa, that has a lot of Islamic-based terrorism. Of course, we have Iraq, we have Afghanistan, we have Syria, we have Pakistan has quite a bit, India has quite a bit as well, Russia has a lot of Islamic-based terrorism that kind of foments and trains there because it's such a big country. This is Colombia. A lot of this is not Islamic-based. This is more political-based, mostly from back in the 80s and 90s. Some communist or Marxist revolutionaries are still in existence and still operate there as well. United States, we are in fairly high impact for obvious reasons. So the question we have to ask is, if they target civilians, why? And it's pretty straightforward, and there are several reasons. First of all, they punish civilians in order to punish the state, country, for perceived grievances. These could be things like having military troops stationed there in their country that they don't like, or past wars that they found unjust, or taking members of their group and putting them in prison, or even killing them in military raids. Those are things that are often used as excuses. So like the Israeli settlements, Palestinians, a group called Hamas, which is still in existence, Palestinian terrorist organization, commits acts of terrorism against Israeli troops and even civilians against civilians in order to punish Israel for settling in areas that have been designated for the Palestinians. Retaliation. So the idea that you attacked us, we attack you. Things like, for example, Sunni versus Shia violence. So those are the 2 main sects of Islam. Sunni being the majority, they don't like each other, they don't get along. Overall, that's painting them both with a very broad brush, which really isn't fair, but overall they really don't get along. A lot of the violence in Iraq was caused by Sunni versus Shia violence that the United States just kind of got in the middle of, or even stirred up a little bit unknowingly. So that's an example of retaliation, terrorism, and they would usually target mosques, government centers, markets, places where there are a lot of civilians congregating. International fame. This was especially in the age of media, where terrorism gets lots of media coverage. So I don't want to say good, but an effective way to get your terrorist group notoriety and attention, and therefore even money being provided by different donors, is to have a successful terror attack that is broadcast over TV, such as 9/11. Also, it's a way of gaining what they see as credibility from the outside world. They see notoriety, in a sense, as credibility. Number 4 is ransom terrorism, and this is not as much anymore. Ransom terrorism is the idea that you commit acts of terrorism, particularly take political hostages like government leaders or families of government leaders, in order to get a ransom. Not always money, but usually it was things like wanting members of your own terror group released from prison, or wanting a manifesto of yours read over the radio or put on TV so other people can hear what your beliefs are. This was really common back in the kind of Cold War, post-World War II terrorism that took place when you had sort of the leftist Marxist terror groups in Italy, You had the Red Faction Brigade. In France, you had the Action Directe. And countless others. In Spain, you had the Basque Brotherhood. That's the way that they got their message across, or the way that they got their people who were kidnapped or put in prison and free, was by taking government leaders hostage and getting them released. And also to promote revolution. This is one that still happens today. One of the main purposes of Islamic terrorism is to, and I say Islamic terrorism not to say that all terrorism is Islamic today, it's not even close to the truth, but Islamic terrorism is what we see mostly on our Western TV stations when we talk about terrorism, although domestic terrorism here in the United States, more of the far-right terrorism is gaining more and more attention, but is to promote revolution, try to overthrow or to promote kind of this grassroots revolution over what they see as an unfair, unjust, or pagan government. Terrorism has seen several changes. It is a dynamic thing. It doesn't stay static. There are many ways it's changed, even since 9/11. So we're going to go over just a few of them really quick. So in the last 30 years, 3 main ways that terrorism has shifted. First of all, ability to inflict massive, massive damage. We saw that in 9/11. We've seen that in countless terror attacks since. You have subway bombings. You have theater massacres like in France. You have gas attacks that happen in Japan and Tokyo subways. Just the ability to cause absolute massive damage. One of the ways it's oftentimes not thought of is cyber terrorism. Cyber terrorism is one of the fastest growing terror offshoots that you can think of. ISIS had a increasingly sophisticated cyber terror network. Al-Qaeda, lots of others. A lot of the Shia-based terrorist groups that Iran supports have fairly sophisticated cyber terror where they attack nations' infrastructures, their electronic grids. They try to hack in and steal information or put in malware in the military or different civilian businesses. So it's significant. It's very significant. WMDs, which refers to weapons of mass destruction, usually refers to 3 things: nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. One of the worst case scenarios that anti-terror specialists keeps them up at night is a terrorist group getting a hold of nuclear weapons. Because during the Cold War, Russia and the United States came close a few times. I'd say close in quotations, to using them against each other, but we had the principle of what's called MAD, M-A-D, which is mutually assured destruction. If we launched against Russia, they launched against us, we both wipe each other out. Neither side wants that, so that was the deterrent. Death was the deterrent, massive death. If some of these terror organizations get a hold of them, especially some of these ideologically or religious-centered ones, death is not considered a deterrent. Death is actually preferred. There's actually there's a belief in some of these that death, by dying through committing one of these acts, your afterlife will be that much better. Therefore, that is a worst-case scenario, which is why oftentimes nuclear stockpiles are guarded, even more so than even chemical and biological weapons, because those can do massive damage, but nowhere close to what a fully functioning nuclear weapon, even a small one, can kill tens of thousands in a matter of seconds. Also, they're able to move members around the world. That's also part of the ability to inflict massive damage. We have seen recruiting done through the internet, which activates members from all different countries. No longer do they have to travel to one terrorism center to do training and such. There are ways to recruit, convince, and train members through the internet. Number 2, smaller groups. These terrorism groups oftentimes will operate in either smaller groups, or even individually. The lone wolf terror group. If you remember the Boston Marathon bombing, the Tsarnaev brothers, they were pretty much, at least the younger one, was a grassroots. They didn't really go to a terrorism training center where the United States intelligence could track them and label them as terrorists. They were convinced, radicalized is the term that you would hear a lot. They were convinced of their cause through the internet, and they talked through the internet, different chat rooms and such, to some of the more higher ups in the terrorist organizations, and they were given their missions, and then they were left to carry it out. So smaller cells are a lot harder to track by law enforcement. Like I said, they don't need international travel. You can't track their passports. And oftentimes, these cells blend in easier because people are radicalized in their own culture. It's not that you see someone from another culture who acts differently, looks differently, moving in next to you. It's your neighbor. It's the people that you never would suspect because they look just like you. They dress the same way, they talk the same way because they are like you on the external. And oftentimes, if you are fortunate enough to capture members of a cell or an independent lone wolf terrorist, they have no idea what the other members of their group are doing. So even if you are successful in getting them to talk and you can confirm that they're telling the truth, they oftentimes don't know. One hand does not know what the other hand is doing, and that is counterintelligence being done by these terrorist groups to keep their overall big plans from being spilled if one of their members is caught or captured or killed. And the third one, the willingness to do greater carnage. There was never really a code of ethics among terrorists. I mean, the willingness to kill children, babies, non-combatants in general is horrid. But there were some sort of unofficial limits, things that today would probably cause the jaws to drop of terrorists, 50 years ago. The idea of driving passenger planes full of people and full of jet fuel into large business buildings in full view really wasn't something that was fathomed much during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Kind of what you saw, the worst things you saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were terrorists actually taking down passenger planes, so hijacking them and then blowing them up. Killing hundreds, but nowhere close to the thousands from 9/11 and some of the subsequent terror activities. So they are much more willing. And this comes from, again, that religion component. And I'm not singling out any religion. There are many religions who have had nefarious practices in history, but some interpretations of some religions people see as a divine mandate to kill. So they see it as their religious duty not just to kill, but to kill as many as possible. And again, they're oftentimes perfectly willing to go down with the ship, to die along with the people that they are killing. So it's that religion component that actually motivates individuals or groups to take a much harder line and look for ways in which they can kill the most amount of people. It's no longer doing a terrorist act that necessarily completes their goal. It's doing a terrorist act that has the most amount of attention and does the most carnage. JFK, this is not related to terrorism, but he has a famous quote that if someone, this had to do actually with political assassination, which he was speaking about. He was basically speaking almost from the grave because he was assassinated, but in regarding to assassination attempts, he said that I'm doing a bad paraphrase, but if someone is willing to give their life to kill someone else, then there's no way to stop them. And that refers to terrorism. If a terrorist is willing to give his own life or her life in order to kill, it's hard to stop them. And again, two groups that are increasingly recruited for terrorism are women and children. One of the videos you're going to watch next class is a PBS video on how ISIS, one of the more vicious, they're all vicious, but one of the more vicious terror groups and media savvy terror groups recruited children to be their killers, to be the next generation of terrorists. We see this huge carnage in 9/11, the Paris attacks, which killed hundreds, Madrid subway attack again killed hundreds. So obviously, a much greater willingness to kill more. And we come to this question: the video that you watched should have addressed: is terrorism ever justifiable? You'll learn that terrorists do have motives why they commit terror, and some of them even seem to have a little bit of, or some sense to them, or legitimate complaints, legitimate beefs. But is the act of targeting civilians, non-combatants, ever justifiable? And you have this cliche that in the video the guy said is a terrible cliche. I disagree. It's one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The experts, I forget his name, but his opinion was the terrorists target civilians, the freedom fighters don't. It might be an argument of semantics, but I would consider freedom fighters some of the far left freedom fighter groups like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and some of the Marxist revolutionary groups from the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, who, although they might have had some legitimate beefs with far-right fascist governments, would target civilians in government-run or government centers. When they would go through a village that would support the government, there was no one there who was off limits. So I would say that freedom fighters would target civilians at times as well. But the idea is, if it's a terrorist or freedom fighter, depends on what side of the battle you're on. Does that have any credence to it, or you do see a clear difference between those two? That's a question that you might want to stop and consider. The cost of terrorism in billions of dollars globally. As you can see, this costs billions of dollars all throughout the world, and this doesn't include things like lost tourism and some of the ripple effect that terrorism causes. And that's it. Next class, you'll be watching a couple short documentaries from PBS on a couple more specific, I would say, areas of terrorism, one of which is recruiting children, and there's another one that I'm going to kind of just leave up to a mystery that you're going to watch and answer some questions about as well. Again, I miss you all. I hope to see you either through Google Class or through Google Hangouts or through Zoom at some point, or, Lord willing, even in person, praying that this coronavirus goes away quicker than expected. So hang in there. Let me know if I can do anything to help, and I will talk to you later. Mr. Stark out. Hello, political science students. This is Mr. Stark. This is my final lecture I will be giving you in your tenure at Heron High School. I wish it could be in person. I wish I could say a lot more. But suffice to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed having each and every one of you in class. I've enjoyed our discussions. I've enjoyed our lighter moments. If you just heard that, that was my 3-year-old letting us know that he's excited about something. But I've enjoyed talking about my kids with you guys, hearing your stories. It has been a delight and joy to have you guys in class, and really this year it has been a relief to have you guys, my seniors, at the beginning of the day. It just really gets the day off to a good start because I have you guys on B1 and B2. So thank you for that, and anything else I can do for you guys, let me know. But without further ado, let's start the grand finale of Stark's lectures. So we left off with terrorism, and we kind of did a couple mini lessons on that. Hopefully you weren't too depressed about that, but I wanted to give you different perspectives on modern terrorism around the world, both domestic and foreign. We're going to pick up and finish up with group versus group violence, which primarily is conflicts between nations, not states, not countries, but nations, different nation groups. for lack of a better word. The reasons, typically there's four. There's separation, so you try to separate and form your own sovereign state, like the Arabs, Syrians versus the Kurds. So the Arabs, Syrians do not want the Kurds to separate and form their own state because that would take away some of their land and also some of their oil fields. Second is political domination. A third one is economic domination. And fourth one's cultural domination. Has echoes in colonialism there. A term which we've gotten to know well since we talked about Rwanda is genocide. This falls underneath this. The targeted political violence resulting in mass killings of one ethnic group, the Hutus and the Tutsis. I would still urge you to watch Hotel Rwanda, even if, since we didn't get to finish it, we just kind of started it. It is a good movie. It's not an uplifting movie, but it's a good movie about the Hutu and Tutsi hatred. Anyway, so again, the Hutu-Tutsi genocide, the Hutus against the Tutsis is an example of one. There have been many throughout the years, the Armenian genocide by the Turks in the early 20th century, obviously the Holocaust, and then in Bosnia, Yugoslavia split up into several different countries, Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, each of different ethnic groups, none of them liking each other, and the Serbians began a campaign of genocide against the Bosnians, in which the United States intervened in the 1990s to try and end the genocide. The next type is individual or group versus the state. 5 types here. First of all, you have a coup. That means leadership's replaced by violent means or threat of violence. It doesn't necessarily have to have actual overt violence, but the threat of violence is definitely one. So, for example, if the military let the president know that you no longer have our support, you better leave. That would be a coup, even though the military didn't actually violently remove the leader. Bangladesh had 21 coups in the first 36 years as a country. So over one, about a coup every year and a half. Egypt, the military, if you remember from the square, you had Mubarak left voluntarily. And then their military kind of took control in the interim period. Then they had elections where Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood won. Well, he started basically becoming another dictator, so the military removed him violently from power. That would be a coup. These are countries that have had coup or coup attempts, and the United States is in that. We had at the beginning of our nation a couple coup attempts, one Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. Both would be considered coup attempts, both unsuccessful. Second one are riots or rebellions. Riots are spontaneous or disorganized group violence. It's not a coordinated campaign pre-planned. It's oftentimes spontaneous. Example of the Rodney King beating in the 1990s. You weren't alive, but the media got videotape of several Los Angeles police officers beating an African American gentleman named Rodney King senseless. That didn't cause the riot. What actually caused the riot was when the police officers were acquitted, starting a riot which destroyed a large portion of Los Angeles. So that would be an example of a riot. Often starts as a demonstration. So the line between a demonstration and a riot can easily be crossed, depending on the response of the police or the authorities, or on the intent or the makeup of the demonstrators. Many times demonstrators, they might seem like they all want the same thing, but there's groups that are a little more, I should say, prone to violence than others. A rebellion is frequent, premeditated, and widespread. This is not local. This is a riot which has spread, and now it has become a systemic, countrywide issue. Most rebellions are actually not successful. Many of them are, such as our famous, such as, I almost said our revolution, which we'll see the difference between those terms. Depending on whether you call our revolution a revolution or rebellion, depends what you think about it. But depending on where you fall on the Civil War spectrum, the rebellion from the southern states was unsuccessful, but there have been many rebellions that have been successful. The Arab Spring Rebellion started as riots, spread and became successful rebellions. 3 is separatist violence. This usually refers to a group's attempt to split the state. It could be considered like one nation's violence, for example, like the Irish Republican Army of the UK colonized Northern Ireland, like their record as a colonial nation, or any colonial nation. I cannot think of a benevolent colonial empire, to be honest, but they were fairly repressive against the Irish, and so there was a long-term separatist movements to try and free them from the British, which spilled in decades and decades of violence. So yeah. Another example, before we went into Vietnam, post-World War II, what we now know as Vietnam was French Indochina. France lost Vietnam before it became that to the Japanese in World War II. After the war was over, it became French territory again. However, the Viet Minh is what they were called, which was a broad coalition of different political movements. One of the most well-known became the Viet Cong under Ho Chi Minh, communists, and they fought the French successfully. And when they became a nation, it was split between the North and South, North being communist, South being democratic led as well. Many times these separatist movements are seen as a response to colonialism, so kind of rebels. When the Roman Empire, for example, almost every single province had separatist movements. For example, in Judea, you had a group called the Zealots, which was a group of Jewish separatists who opposed Roman rule through means of violence. So yeah. And a civil war, this is an important term, is a large part of the population supports the separatist movement and large-scale violence. So this is when it crosses into a civil war. When it's just separatist violence, when it's an offshoot group who doesn't represent a large portion of the population, and violence is not widespread and systemic. Civil war it is, like our Civil War. Separatist movements, red, there's a lot, all the way down to green, almost non-existent. Revolution is number 4, and one of the questions I'm going to ask you on your challenge questions is, do you consider the American Revolution a true revolution or rebellion? Why or why not? So a revolution is a rapid and massive transformation of the government and class structure. A good example would be the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It was violent. A lot of people lost their heads. A lot of people were shot. A lot of horrors happened on both sides, the Tsarist forces and the Bolshevik forces. But it also changed the political and class structure from a top-down monarchy with the Tsar at the top to a bottom-up, in theory, Bolsheviks where the people supposedly hold the power, although, as you know your history, that didn't really happen. The communists had their own elite that they put in power, such as Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin eventually, Molotov, lots of others. But that's a revolution. French Revolution, same thing. Went from a monarchy to several different democracies at several different phases as well. Now, the important thing is a revolution's not always violent. Often is, not always violent. It could wane from guerrilla war, which is basically not called non-conventional war, where it's not you stand up and look your enemy in the eye. It's like ambushes and booby traps and stuff like that. Some revolutions could be democratic revolutions where the leaders are voted in who drastically change the government and system. And usually it's an oppressed people rising up against the government, not of their choosing. So this is frequent in places that don't have democracies established. And finally, war. State against state. Country against country. And this is defined as interstate violence that is sustained, organized, and involve regular military forces. Famous Prussian militarist named Karl von Clausewitz wrote a book that's still read in West Point called On War. Said war is regarded as nothing but a continuation of political activity by other means. So war fits very firmly under the realm of politics. So what makes it a war? There's got to be criteria. Here they are. The use of armed forces between two or more governments or one government and one large group. Now this is kind of arbitrary, but at least 1,000 battle-related deaths, and this would be something that would vary depending on what textbook you read. Conflict over control of government or territory. That's important as well. Those have to be one of those two or both those causes. So these are countries with active armed conflicts, not necessarily wars, but many of them being wars. Mexico obviously being one against the drug cartels, and many in Africa. The unfortunate truth is at any one time in Africa, there's at least half a dozen civil wars going on. Some recent trends in modern war. These are some things we've seen in studying war over the last 75 years. Fewer conventional sustained wars. Fewer wars that you see continued sustained conflict over long periods of time. Shorter wars. Wars are no longer 100 years, like the 100 Years' War or 30 Years' War. Most wars are under 10 years. Less frequent. It seems that we're living in a turbulent time period, which is true. But if you do the math, look at the statistics, and use the criteria to determine what are wars and what are not, wars are actually less frequent over the last, 50 years, 75 years. More combatants not in uniform, which makes it extremely difficult. Adds a very large complication to war. War is always complex, but this adds another one. Who is the enemy, especially when the enemy dresses like the local population, something that our soldiers in Vietnam faced, something that our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan faced. More reliance on guerrilla warfare. Again, this is the warfare that's not forces that engage each other actively. This is more of the kind of like the way our American Revolution was fought in like Florida and Georgia using guerrilla tactics. You ambush forces, you hit forces hard and then fade away. You set up traps and booby traps for them. You conduct raids against supply bases, things like that. And then finally, what makes a nation more likely to go to war? And there are some criteria that political scientists have. New states, new nations, states tend to go to war more often, such as Israel. Israel became a nation in 1945. Within 12 months, they were fighting a war for independence. In the United States, we won our independence, and then before long, we were at war with Britain again, 1812. State where citizens are socialized to accept government action. So where citizens basically accept what the government says, especially when it's a militaristic government. What comes to mind probably is North Korea, where the people believe much of what North Koreans tell them, including that the Americans are poised at the border of 38th parallel and are ready to cross the border. Rising prosperity, but still relatively poor. So rising prosperity, especially in a nation that doesn't have the infrastructure or political infrastructure to distribute it, more likely to go to war. Desirable geopolitical features like resources. Think of the nation of Africa. not well linked in with the global economy. Something we talked about with trade and economics is an advantage of trade between countries is countries are less likely to go to war. You are less likely to go to war with countries you trade with. Highly militarized countries that the government's militarized. The leader was a military leader. Still wears uniform. They have parades. Again, think of North Korea, even Russia, other nations like that. Highly nationalistic. Now, this is not just you're patriotic. You love your country, you support your country. This is where you believe that your country is superior to others and support your country's right to then intervene and conquer other countries as well. Nationalism has kind of gotten a very broad definition, especially in America. Nationalism traditionally in political science refers to more overt, more violent tendencies to exert your country's will. And that's it. Again, it's been a pleasure. Email me with questions. Do the challenge questions. Next, take a look at the study guide. Those are some of the questions you're going to face in your final class in political science. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you later. Stark out.